the minutes at that time. Nothing else needs to have a quorum, although it would be nice to have everybody participating. So, because the COVID-19 pandemic is ongoing, the chair of the Metropolitan Council has determined that it is not practical or prudent to conduct in-person meetings. Accordingly, Land Use Advisory Committee members will participate in this meeting by telephone or interactive technology, and this Land Use Advisory Committee meeting will be conducted under Minnesota Statute Section 13D.021. And with that, I will call the March 17th, 2022 meeting of the Land Use Advisory Committee to order, and we will begin with a roll call. Sandy.
Okay, we'll start with Sado Abdi. Let's see. Or, John Bottoman is here. Gerald Bruner.
Here.
He is here. Jennifer Geisler. Not here. April Graves. Kathy Hemken.
Here.
Noah Keller.
Here.
Phil Klein.
Here.
Tristan Mattacastillo. Kathy Mokel. Steve Morris. Mark Nelson. Maitra Jalali. Dan Rowe.
Here.
Let's see, Bill Drost.
Here.
And Wendy Wall.
Here.
Okay.
What are we at? One short of a quorum?
Madam Chair?
Yes.
Yes. Yes, Jerry.
I'm signed in as Jerry Bruner, not Gerald Bruner. So if that's the problem that was there.
No, that's fine. Don't worry about it.
Okay.
Okay.
So
So,
we're at
pardon,
7.
Sandy?
We're at 7, so not a quorum.
Okay. Then we will skip the minutes. The approval of the agenda is by consensus. Is there anybody who has any objections to the posted agenda, want to make any changes? Not seeing any, the agenda is approved as written. We will move on to the information items. First one is the 2022 system statements with Angela Torres. I think you're muted, Angela.
I mean, I was doing so well too. Sorry. I think, can you hear me now?
I can hear you.
Okay.
Yes, we can.
Thank you. So good afternoon. I'm Angela Torres, Manager of Local Planning Assistance. Council staff plan to issue system statements to local governments as part of our work to implement the Metropolitan Land Planning Act. These are considered mid-cycle system statements. So these 2022 system statements are being issued because of updates to regional transportation and parks system plans. LUAC has a defined statutory role in potential hearings related to system statements when disputes may occur. And I have a brief presentation today that will talk about the role of system statements in the regional planning cycle, give an overview of the content and purpose of system statements, and share the relationship to the Council's planning documents. Next slide, please. So this graphic reflects the decennial planning cycle. If we start at the last issuance of system statements in 2015 as part of the decennial planning process, you can see that it is system statements that prompt the update of local comprehensive plans. The Council has been busy authorizing those plans since they were due in 2018. Most communities are in the implementation phase of the regional planning process right now. And implementation of both regional and local plans may include amendments to local comp plans. So may include amendments. So we'll talk about that more on the next slide. The Regional Development Guide, currently called Thrive MSP 2040, includes system and policy plans for transportation, which includes highways, transit, and airports, as well as wastewater services, regional parks and open space, and housing. The Regional Development Guide work will continue to be the focus going forward until the new 2050 plan is adopted by the Council. Next slide, please. Thank you. System statements identify for each community the changes that have been made to system plans and identify what the impact of those changes are to each local government. The decennial system statements include not only system and policy plan updates, but notify local governments of forecasted growth and general development expectations. Although the mid-cycle system statements, this isn't always necessary. For example, with the 2022 system statements, there were no large-scale changes at the regional level to forecasted growth, although forecast adjustments for individual communities are common with comprehensive plan amendments. Next slide, please. The decennial system statements are in the light blue on the left side of the screen. The mid-cycle 2022 system statements are represented in the darker blues and green on the right side of the screen. I show both so that you can get a snapshot of the information that is shared during the decennial updates to the Regional Development Guide and its accompanying system and policy plans in comparison to the mid-cycle system statements. It's much more comprehensive when the Council updates all of the regional system and policy plans, as well as community designations, regional forecast, affordable housing need. The water resources system plans are also a part of that too. Right now, both the transportation and park system plans have mid-cycle planning requirements. So an interval that isn't expected of all of those other components are expected for the transportation and parks system plans. This is, I think, I don't know if any of you remember, but in 2022, it's common we saw the Regional Parks Policy Plan have an amendment specifically targeted towards system additions. And so now with the most recent update to the TPP that happened the first Wednesday of the month, I think it was at the Met Council, the last Met Council meeting, we have now come to a point where we issue system statements again. The TPP was just recently updated at that Met Council meeting. So each system section of the system statement includes key changes to the regional plan, system plan considerations affecting the community, and any other plan considerations if they apply. For example, transportation includes freight, for example. One thing I want to kind of emphasize is that system statements, particularly these mid-cycle system statements, only reflect key changes. So if there weren't any changes, the community gets a broad overview of the region-wide changes, but nothing may impact the city at the local level, and so they may not have any requirements or considerations to examine as part of their comprehensive plan. Next slide, please. Thank you. While the system statement is the official trigger that marks the beginning of the local comprehensive planning update process, it's not meant to stand alone. So rather, system statements are one of three other kind of major components that direct and guide communities as they update their plans. The Regional Development Guide, which I've mentioned, includes all of the system and policy plans, contains the regional infrastructure plans, as well as specific policies and strategies guiding the growth and development of the region. The system statement is a distillation of key changes in infrastructure plans in the Metropolitan System plans. And then the local planning handbook is a guide and resource that explains what specific information is required in local plans in order for the council to fully evaluate the plan's conformance to system plans, consistency with council policy, and compatibility with the plans of adjacent and affected jurisdictions. Next slide, please. Thank you. If a community has questions or disagrees with an item in the system statement, communities first reach out to their sector reps. This is where most of the questions about system statements are handled. Sector reps work very hard with local government partners to provide answers, discuss options, and resolve any issues. The community can request a hearing within 60 days. If a resolution is not able to be reached, the community can request that the Council's Land Use Advisory Committee or the Office of Administrative Hearings holds a hearing, which will then result in a report with findings and recommendations to the Metropolitan Council. The Council ultimately makes the final determination based on the report. If a community doesn't object within 60 days, the statement's considered final. Communities move forward with any needed amendments to their comp plan, and they would just follow the typical comp plan amendment process and submit those to the council for review. In the last decennial planning cycle, there were 6 requests for hearing, with only 1 request moving forward to an actual hearing. The other requests were resolved through discussions between communities and council staff. The mid-cycle system statements usually have even fewer disputes than the decennial system statements because mid-cycle changes usually don't have a significant impact on local plans and usually do not impact as many communities. If a community does request a hearing before LUAC, though, we'll definitely provide the support and resources that you will need in order to conduct a hearing that would include what the statutory requirements are, the rule, the time frame, etc. We would provide that for you. With that, I'll conclude, and I'm happy to answer any questions.
Thank you, Angela. Does anybody have any questions?
So Angela, when will they be released, or have they?
Not yet. We're on a sliding time frame. We had anticipated being ready to send those out the end of the month. I think it'll creep into the first week or 2 of April. There's not a set time for the mid-cycle system statements in statute, and so the council makes its best determination on when those will get sent out. So we're working with our parks and transportation staff internally to get those all compiled, maps created, and all of the other work that goes in with that.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Phil?
Yeah, thank you, Chair Wolf. I did have a question. I know that we talked a little bit about this at MOSAC, but with this court order with the White Bear Lake lawsuit that's pending right now, that's going to have a major effect, possibly, if it goes through, on the East Metro as far as economic development, water use, and just overall growth, as well as the Metropolitan or the MUSA line, the sewer line. How would that be addressed in these statements if that was to happen?
Chair.
Go ahead, Angela.
Thank you, and Chair and committee members. As I mentioned, the system statements only reflect changes to system plans and policies adopted by the Metropolitan Council. So I imagine whatever would happen with the lawsuit will happen, but as long as the council's plans and policies haven't changed, they're not reflected. There's challenges all across the region, let's say that, and at different stages. The policy plans and system plans of the council, though, are adopted, as council action. And so until that would happen, the plans or the system statements wouldn't reflect any of those issues, whatever they may be.
So basically, when we update our water and sewer plans as part of the big update, then that would go out to cities.
Right. And again, it would be dependent on what was within the system and policy plans too.
Does that answer your question, Phil?
Yes, that's fine. Thank you.
Did you have any other questions?
Hello?
Anybody else? Okay, well, thank you very much, Angela.
Thank you.
And we will move on to our next agenda item, which is the community designations with Raya Esmaeili and Jake Reilly.
Hello, Madam Chair, committee members. Can you still hear me okay?
Yes, we can.
Wonderful. My name is Raya Esmaeili. I'm a senior planner in local planning assistance, bringing community designations back to you from last month with some additional information and hoping to have a fruitful discussion with you today. Next slide, please. So in the last month, on January 20th LUAC meeting, what we talked about, we covered the importance of community designations, how community designations help further regional policy outcomes through direction that they set forth, that they're used to plan and implement the regional policies at local level, land use policies and density expectations being based on community designations. And it's a way for us to distinguish similarities and differences between communities and to protect agricultural natural areas and direct growth on areas with urban infrastructure. We also talked about the history of community designations, that they have existed as part of the regional development guides for several decades. They used to be called geographic planning areas. There are some rural considerations that have remained over time, and that in the last round, the way that community designations were defined slightly changed with variable and the process that was used. For this project, our process involves two big components of engagement and analysis, with engagement being primarily our team working with you, LUAC members, as the recommending body throughout 2022, and also working with an external and internal focus group, local planners, and also staff from different areas. And we will also be engaging with the rest of the council through Committee of the Whole and some additional coordination as part of the regional planning efforts. And the analysis being the evaluation of current variables, we explore new ones. It's going to be an iterative process. We take in feedback, analyze, bring it back to you, take more feedback, analyze, bring it back to you, hopefully coming to a conclusion that fits the direction that this committee sets forth. The timeline of this project is that we are going to be at every LUAC meeting in 2022. We also have monthly stakeholder meetings in addition to LUAC meetings. We're hoping that we bring some final options for LUAC by the September meeting in the hopes that the recommendations from LUAC can reach CDC and the Metropolitan Council for adoption in December of 2022. Considering we understand that this is a pretty ambitious timeline, so we're going to try our best to stick with that. And finally, the deliverables of this project being 5 pieces, a set of criteria to define community designations. There's 5 of them in Thrive in the last round. The actual proposed community designations, the descriptions of those designations, density expectations based on community designations, and maps and other data for community designations. So before we move forward, I just want to make sure that the committee doesn't have any, if there are any questions about the recap from the January meeting. Any comments?
Any questions?
Okay.
I would like to thank you for the great memo that you put together, giving all of the background for people to dig through, and I found it very helpful.
Yeah, of course. Thank you for looking through that. I'm going to hand it off to Jake for the rest of the presentation for now. Jake, go ahead.
Thanks, Raya. Can everybody hear me okay?
Yes.
It looks like before I go, Chair Wolf, it appears that maybe Mr. Klein has a question.
I believe his hand is just still up from before.
Okay. Just want to make sure. Thank you.
I apologize, Jake.
No problem.
Carry on, please.
Thank you. So I'm gonna turn off my video because of I'm in a coffee shop and I just want to make sure I don't lose all of you. But as long as you can keep hearing me, I'll keep an eye on Raya. Maybe she can tell me if you can't hear me. Next slide, please, Greg. So you may have remembered me and another sector rep, Patrick Boylan, coming to talk to you about the debrief that project that we've been undertaking to look at how the last or the current, I guess, round of comp plan reviews has been going. And so we went back to sort of tie all the pieces together. We went back and looked at the information gathered through that process to identify any areas related to community designations specifically, and if there was feedback from local communities and consultants that were provided regarding those community designations. And some of the things that are kind of related to community designations, but not specific to sort of how communities are designated or what designations they have, given that they can have more than one, were advice to us that we ensure that the technical assistance we provide is appropriately tailored for each community designation, especially those with multiple community designations. And many community staff, particularly those in the emergent suburban edge communities and diversified rural communities, and maybe Greg, while I'm talking about this, you could go to slide 4 so folks can see that. Designations to sort of get an idea for who those communities are. So suburban edge, diversified rural communities expressed concerns that neither the checklist nor the final plans that were authorized by the council reflected necessarily the specific needs of their communities. Communities that are suburban in nature but have limited connectivity to the transit system, especially if they are not part of an opt-out system, felt a little bit ignored from a transit perspective. Feedback we heard suggested that they'd like the council policy plans to more clearly be tied to community designations. There also seems to be a lack of understanding regarding, on our part, on the council's part, regarding the housing market when we develop community designations, and which is further complicated when plans or amendments are being drafted for communities with orderly annexation agreements or those that could initiate them because of where they are located in the region. I think right now about a project I'm working on with Cottage Grove, who's seeing tremendous development, but not in where they anticipated it to be when they submitted their plan to us. So thinking about the outcome of the planning process when assigning community designations was something that was suggested to us, and how will plans from different designations be similar and or different from each other, and how could or should they be? And then also we were it was suggested to us that we remember to recognize that agricultural and rural communities have different needs regarding outcomes along with those different characteristics, and carry that through the planning process. And I think that covers it. And so we're going to start the sort of conversation part here. And I'm going to ask all of you to let us know if anything in those findings stands out or is of particular interest to you, or rings true to your experience or the experience of the staff and the communities that you live and work in and with.
Does anyone have any comments?
Madam Chair,
Seeing any hand? Oh, Jerry, go ahead.
say, does the Met Council at all figure, like Carver County is the fastest growing county in the state, and I see it out here. Cities are expanding, they're annexing township property into cities for development. Does a Metropolitan Council have any idea where in, say, 20 years, 30 years, how that far that development is going to stretch from where it is now? And in reality, it's going to take out farmland. So is there any planning that goes into how much of that farmland will be in the housing in 30 years or anything like that?
Do you guys want to answer that, or you want me to answer it?
We can answer it. Jake, if you want, I can go ahead and answer that.
Please do.
Yeah, thank you, Chair, committee members. The part of regarding annexations, I'm going to start from there. Those would be in the realm of local decision making. As far as there are any orderly annexation agreements, we can anticipate some growth and some change in development in certain areas. But if they are not, written as orderly annexation agreements, we can't necessarily know what exactly is going to happen. That being said, the local planner's perspective is something that they provide to us while we're doing forecasting and available land and looking at where growth can happen. And some of those comments and feedback can feed into our land use and forecast modeling. But one thing that you mentioned about how much of the farmland going to be taken away by development, I do want to emphasize that one of the roles that the community designations play is to protect the farmland and agricultural areas as much as possible. So as it actually shows on the screen, it kind of shows how through density expectations, we try to minimize impact of development in these areas, and that saying that there is not going to be regional wastewater infrastructure. So there are policies and in place that are associated with some of the community designations in these areas that are meant to protect those farmlands and natural areas so that we don't see a sprawling region that is not efficient in development. I hope that answered the question.
I would also add that our wastewater system officially plans out 30 years, but unofficially they look out more like 70 years to figure out the sizes of pipes and whatnot to be efficient in the long term, because it's a lot easier to put big pipes down than to put a little pipe and dig it up and put a bigger pipe and so on. It's if people want to be connected to the regional sewer system, it's very much controlled by that long-term plan that takes into account geography and elevations and all of that in the planning. For other places like New Germany that has its own wastewater system plan, they have a little more say in where they're going to go because they're the ones that are making the sewer pipes. But economics drives a lot of it. And I've been really actually surprised to see, because Dakota County has been growing rapidly for decades. I'm surprised to see how little it's actually pushed out into the agricultural areas, given that it's been rapid growth for 40 years in Lakeville. So we're not spreading as much as other urbanized areas are. Does that answer your question, Jerry?
Thank you, Madam Chair. Somewhat, that's kind of what I was getting at. Does the Met Council, are they trying to anticipate some of the cities here in Carver County do not have waste treatment, water treatment plants and everything. It all goes down to Savage, of course. So I was just wondering if there's any thought, or does the Met Council have any way to kind of judge how much capacity is already in the ground, and how much more capacity can it take before it's going to have to dig up the big pipes and put even bigger pipes in? So
they do look at that. Yes.
That's kind of what I was getting at.
We have actually pretty precise data, because the way that we pay for the system is based on how much excess capacity the people that are connecting in pay towards that excess capacity, and your just regular wastewater quarterly payments or whatever go towards the maintenance of the infrastructure that's not excess capacity. So our ES people figure that out pretty much every year and can tell you by wastewater treatment plant, where they are compared to their total capacity and how far out they've scheduled any capacity improvements to the system. If you want more details about the area in Carver County that is served by the regional system, we can get that for you.
Okay. Thank you, Madam Chair. No, that's not necessary right at this moment, but it was just a thought of mine because I am on that comp committee, and it's, you know, if you're trying to plan a 2050 comp plan, to me, that's a crapshoot. I don't know how you're going to do it. So I was just kind of trying to ask if how the Met Council kind of tries to figure out where's it going to be in, 28 years. How do they do that?
Yeah, we do that.
Okay.
Thanks. Any other questions or comments? Okay.
All right, I'll go ahead. I think, Mr. Bruner, your last comment is actually pretty pertinent to this slide, and it might help with some context. One of the ways in community designations, one of the ways that the land use densities sort of go along with the capacity of the wastewater treatment system is that we don't plan for densities greater than they can support at the time. So that's why you'll see, like on this slide, the urban center has the highest minimum average density, and the agricultural has the lowest minimum density, because those two things are tied together as part of that orderly and economic development of the region from the land use plan. So maybe that's a little helpful about how, sort of the connection between what's actually under the ground, as you noted, is related to what goes up, as it were. So we do have a number of community designations, and I'm going to go through some of the primary, the sort of the big rocks that are what describe each of these community designations. And we'll start with the most dense and go to the least dense. Urban center communities are the most centrally located. So they include, of course, Minneapolis and St. Paul, but also several of the first ring suburbs, mostly adjacent to Minneapolis. They are the most economically diverse. They have street grids that are planned prior to the Second World War. They have large institutions, the most visited regional parks, and tend to be more conducive to transit use and walking, also known as interconnectivity, and that is fed by, or that's why we've used that number of the network grid and the number of connections as part of developing community designations in the past. And then urban centers also are, of course, experiencing primarily redevelopment with significantly higher densities, and they have the challenge of competing land uses, congestion, and brownfield development, not greenfield development. Then you've got the urban communities. Those were primarily developed between the end of the Second World War and the economic recession of the 70s, the early 70s. They're adjacent to the urban center and experience rapid growth. They tend to be centers for office and commercial industrial uses. The growing influence of the automobile um, is a big part of that. I think about St. Louis Park and Miracle Mile, along with Southdale coming in that time frame there. Wider streets, more curves, larger lots, lots of parking. And then there's transit that go through there, and much of the commuter transit is served by park and rides. There's also similar to the urban centers, you've got the challenge of redevelopment to accommodate greater range of uses, more walkability, biking infrastructure, and then planning for those fixed route transit options, along with other kinds of off-board ticketing options like bus rapid transit. Suburban communities, I always think of it being developed in the 50s, but maybe that's my geographic bias coming from the East Coast. They are primarily developed between the 1980s and the early 1990s along freeway corridors. These include the areas around Lake Minnetonka, around the Stillwater downtown. The downtown of Stillwater rather have sort of similar patterns of development because of the time frame in which they developed. There's continued growth and expansion there, including existing and new corporate headquarters with significantly lower densities. They have more subdivisions with cul-de-sacs, bigger box retail, tend to be auto-oriented, the large regional parks, express bus service. And they have the challenge often of realigning development around those existing and specifically emerging transitways. Suburban edge communities are, again, growth from the 90s to the 2000 teens. We think of those places as a place where at least 40% of the land is developed. There's not a lot of large-scale agricultural land left. They have regions serving retail centers. We continue the theme of auto orientation, demand for transit and parking rides, and similar challenges to the suburban communities in terms of development around future transit expansions, planning for those kinds of activities when they come, and then also providing more opportunity for workforce housing. And many of these parts of the region have water supply issues and may be near and around significant open space, natural areas, water bodies, etc. And then you've got the emergent suburban edge communities, which are in the early stages of transitioning to urbanized. They may have sort of historically small downtowns with a small town character. They face some of those pressures of what happens when you move from being a more rural feel to a suburban environment, and tend to have some of that traditional suburban development style happening now rather than in the 80s and 90s. Then we kind of take a leap into the rural set of our community designation. So we've got rural centers, which are like standalone small towns. They have local commercial employment, residential activities, surrounded by agriculture. They have similar development patterns to urban communities, but at a much smaller scale. They may have municipal or region wastewater treatment services, mix of housing density, again, the same sort of strong commercial service district in a traditional downtown. And this gets perhaps to your point, Mr. Bruner, the growth in those urban or rural centers is looking to utilize existing infrastructure before expanding. They tend to be around the edge of the metro area. Diversified rural communities are farm and non-farm land uses, large lot developments if there's residential, clustered housing, hobby farms, and this is all protected, generally speaking, for more rural lifestyle and potential urbanization post 2040. And again, same thing, large areas of high quality natural resources, prime agricultural land, and then the challenge of those pressures from incompatible uses near agricultural land. And these are the kinds of places that the Metropolitan Council discourages by policy urbanized level of residential to avoid that premature demand for the expansion of the wastewater system. Rural residential is large lot development, primarily residential, no plans to provide urban infrastructure. So they're mostly served by septic systems. And there's often topographic limitations to development, like wetlands, bluffs, etc. And then similarly, their historical development pattern of 1 to 2.5 units per acre doesn't support wastewater expansion. And so this is kind of where that the rubber meets the road on the orderly and economical development clause of the statute. And of course, ag land, prime ag soil, planned for long-term ag use, lots and lots of contiguous land enrolled in agricultural preserves program, and looking at how agriculture is developed in those areas in order to support the economic competitiveness of this region, which is founded on agricultural uses. Decades and decades and decades ago. And the goal is to preserve and protect the region's agricultural economy, provide economic opportunity for farmers, promote local food production, and ensure the preservation of and using best management practices in farm operations. And I didn't give you examples, which maybe I should have, beyond urban center. But for example, we've got suburban communities include places like Eden Prairie. Suburban edge would be Maple Grove and Plymouth. Chaska, and you can see that over time, even in the last couple of years, some of these descriptors of the characteristics that I just read out are becoming perhaps less pertinent. Emergent suburban edge would be Chanhassen, Victoria. We've got places like Norwood, Young America, Mayer, New Germany. I know I can pronounce that properly as a rural center. Et cetera, et cetera. So, as Mr. Bruner suggested, Carver County's got lots and lots of rural residential, diversified rural and ag lands. Similarly, so Scott County, Southern Dakota County, and it's diminishing, but the far eastern portions of Washington County. So that's sort of where we are today. That was what set the stage for the 2040 plans. And I'm going to keep going. Unless there's any reason not to. We good? All right. So just to talk a little bit about on the next slide, Greg, there are times when jurisdictions request community designation changes. Typically, this happens during the comp plan process. And so here you have a visualization of what the communities look like and the why, or who the communities are and the why of it. So in East Bethel, they requested a change from the rural center to diversified rural to better reflect the land uses in East Bethel and how they're changing. And their infrastructure wasn't going to be at the level anticipated for a rural center between now and the 2040 horizon. And there was an area by Ham Lake, the lake itself, to preserve lake quality because getting infrastructure out there won't happen at any time. So it's sort of a neighboring community issue. And the plan was to protect the land through land use and zoning instead of putting in a wastewater system, which is, of course, quite expensive. Oak Grove looked to, or I guess applied to be changed from diversified rural to rural residential. That went through a legislative process that unfortunately I don't have a lot of context for. So if folks have questions about that when I'm done with this section, perhaps Angela or Raya could talk about that. And now then the same thing, legislative process changing from diversified rural to rural residential, which may be related to area left over from a construction of the East Bethel plant. Then we've got Baytown Township, diversified rural to rural residential, because that township itself is mostly already 2.5 to 5 acre lots, and they have quite a rural character. So it was a better fit. And this is why these conversations that we have, both with all of you and with the jurisdictions, planners, and consultants, helps us get to the best place, right? Same thing with North Oaks. Changing from suburban to emergent suburban edge is much more consistent with their existing development staging and patterns. Newport similarly requested to go from urban to suburban because their developable land is limited due to existing topographical features, steep slopes, lakes, shorelands, et cetera, which makes it hard they anticipate it being difficult to achieve the minimum density requirements for an urban community, which are quite significant. Jordan went from a diversified rural to a rural center, and then Jackson Township went from diversified rural to suburban edge. So you can see many of them we're looking at going from more dense to less dense, but there's a handful in there, like the Jackson Township, going from less dense to more dense, kind of a descriptor. And then when we look at what the drivers of community designation change have been, it's primarily related to elements such as orderly annexations, future infrastructure expansion at the local levels, those things. So orderly annexations, as Ryan said earlier, we can plan for those, but other infrastructure expansions, the counts that don't have anything to do with the council's role directly, are harder to know about and plan for in advance. So we certainly see those changes. We anticipate those changes happening regardless. So that sort of covers the why or what or who it changes and when. Is there anything there that stands out? Or any questions, concerns about why, when, and how folks have community designation changes?
Any questions? Looks like we can move on.
Great, moving right along. Next slide, please. So these were the variables that went into the Thrive 2040 and community designations. Primarily the metropolitan urban service area, then the percentage of the developable land already committed to urban uses. And that sort of, we put that together both by the land use plans from the previous planning cycle, along with the plat monitoring program that Raya oversees. Then also looked at the age of the housing stock, which was used as a proxy for the age of the infrastructure and general development patterns. The intersection density, as I noted earlier, which indicates connectivity, urban form, and accessibility. And then the long-term wastewater service area, which is sort of what we're talking about, that sort of planning for the 70 years rather than the 20 or 30 years. So those were the initial variables that went in to the conversation, both at LUAC and with our internal and external partners. And the next slide, Greg, shows that MUSA. And here you can see the 2040 MUSA line, which includes the urban service areas that are not necessarily contiguous. So those rural centers are highlighted there as well. Next slide. Then the next, oops. This is the percentage of developable land committed to urban uses. And at the time, the threshold was used to define those development areas was, is it more than 85% developed? So you can see the central cities and those first ring suburbs of Minneapolis and a couple parts of Ramsey County and close to Stillwater are at greater than 95%. And then as we get out into the more rural and more agriculturally supported areas, the percentage of land that could potentially be developed reduces. Next slide. The age of the housing stock is, again, a proxy for the age of a community, the age of its infrastructure, any potential maintenance needs, development patterns. It also feeds into the housing policy plan, looking at sort of naturally occurring affordable housing and other implications for housing those who live in the metro. Next slide shows an intersection density analysis that was done at the time, which again contributes or sort of demonstrates the connectivity, accessibility, urban form, and the character of development. And we're talking about connectivity. It's the sort of, how far can you walk? How far can you drive to get to what you need? And you can see that there's a lot more intersections in the city, as you might expect, than there are in the more rural areas. But those, I love looking at the rural centers because they have similar intersection densities, which is, I think, why people love living in those places so much. I used to go to school in Northfield, so I just love that, even though it's not in the region. Then the next slide, Greg. We have the long-term wastewater service area, and again, this emphasizes the land to receive service sometime after 2040. So as we're looking forward, we're going to be looking at those areas that are going to receive service sometime after 2050. So this would be pinned to the estimated capacity of each treatment plant, potential developable area for services by plant, and cost and capacity for the most cost-effective service area. And the only reason there's different colors on this particular map is that those are the different wastewater treatment plants. Each of those chunks of color go to one wastewater treatment plant, whether that's a municipal one or an MCES operated one. And I think that covers my portion of the presentation. Any
Jay?
questions? Yeah.
This is Wendy. I would add that the light colors and the dark colors, the dark color is the current or 2040, how far the plant goes. And then the lighter colors are the after 2040 for that same plant. So like the
That's right. Yeah.
Empire plant has dark pink where it serves now, and then light pink is the long-term service area. And like where Jerry was asking about Carver County, most of it is already dark blue, but there's little bits of light blue around there that it will eventually extend to.
And then there's all the white where it is not yet anticipated to extend to, and those are those agricultural places to preserve. So thank you so much, Wendy, for that. I appreciate it.
Oh, you're welcome.
Raya.
Does anybody else have any questions so far? Dan, go ahead.
Right, thank you. Just a question for maybe some clarification on the percentage of the land designated for urban uses. I guess I have a sense of what urban uses might be, but just wanted maybe the 30,000-foot definition of what's considered designated urban uses as you're looking at that percentage of the land that is designated for those types of uses.
You can take that, Jake, if you like.
Pardon?
Yes, because I wasn't necessarily here for that part, so I definitely appreciate Raya taking that
Sure.
on. Thank you.
Chair, committee members, the urban uses are kind of based on expertise, if you will, uses that there isn't an actual definition that I can refer to and say urban use means this specifically. So there was quite a bit of internal discussion that led to this. We do have one of our staff here who can potentially go further into this and talk about what led to that, if Paul wants to jump in. But it was basically an evaluation based on internal expertise. Paul.
Hello, Chair, committee members. I'm Paul Hanson. I have been kind of the main land use person here at the council. I'm a GIS specialist. So I can say a little bit about the land use. Excuse me. And you may have remembered giving a presentation about the land use last year, earlier this year, last year, I guess it was. Anyways, the element of percent developed is primarily based off of the land use inventory work that we have done. And it's primarily just, it's forward. I think Raya is referring to, as we go forward and thinking about it, is a little more nuanced, but primarily it's based off of the land use inventory, and we're looking at land uses such as commercial, residential, industrial that have been developed other than agricultural or unidentified wetlands, things like that. So that is really the basis, is just that there's already an identified developed land use on the land. And the map that you're seeing is kind of the interpretation of what it would be like now, not necessarily what was developed back when we did this 10 years ago, but more kind of what are the current conditions. That's why the percentages are a little bit different. And one of the things that I did try to look at is to take into account wetlands, steep slopes, any sort of easement information that we have available to us to eliminate that as developed land from that equation. So that's the general basis of that. Does that get to your question at this point?
Yes, thank you. I appreciate that.
Okay. You're welcome.
And I just was going to make a quick observation as to related to the intersection density and some of those rural centers. That's kind of off topic of the land use question I had earlier, but I was thinking back to a conversation we had in Roseville about building setbacks and should, you know, suburban communities like Roseville have buildings right up against the curb, and doesn't that feel more like downtown St. Paul or downtown Minneapolis? And I observed to the folks that were attending that meeting that, having grown up in a small town in northern Minnesota, actually the setbacks of the buildings in the downtown of that town were very similar to what we were talking about. And so it's not just a big city feel, it's very much like what was mentioned in the presentation about some of those rural centers having those similar intersection densities. And so that was just an observation I had to throw out there. Thanks again.
Thank you. I had a question for Paul too.
Yeah.
It seems like sometimes as the price of land goes up, spots that were previously deemed not developable become developable because it's worth putting in the dirt moving and retaining walls and whatever else you have to do to make the land work. Do you take that into account?
Yes, we do that. Thank you, Chair, for bringing that up. That's one of the key elements with our land use inventory. You know, one way that an organization could do land use is based off of zoning or what the parcel, how the parcel is being used. But one of the things that makes our inventory slightly different is we do take the ideas that you're bringing into focus here into account. And so particularly when we're looking at larger parcels, 5 acres or more, you know, the current landowner probably feels that is residential and that's how they're going to use it and only going to use it. But we have seen time and time again as development, I don't want to use the word pressure, but I can't think of a better word right off hand. But, you know, as the region expands and all of a sudden, you know, it becomes more economical for them to consider selling off part of their land, we see that happening. So when we do our land use inventory, we do try to identify the portion of the land that is observably being used. So maybe they're only utilizing 1 acre of that 5 acres as their homestead, and the rest is just kind of open fallow field or you know, woodlot or something like that. And then that'll be something that we will say, well, that's not an actual urbanized use. So we're not incorporating that in that calculation. We would only take in that 1 acre out of those 5 acres. So yeah, you're absolutely right. And that is kind of a key element to our land use inventories and gives us an advantage for these forward-thinking ideas that we go take into account.
Thank you. Does anybody else have any questions or comments? Okay, moving on.
Okay, thank you, Chair and committee members. If we can go to the next slide. Before I say anything, I do want to say that all the questions that have come up and the discussion had so far is all very helpful later on as we're going to be talking more about variables and areas of focus and things like that. So I hope that this is helpful for that discussion as well. So one thing that was included or considered, I should say, when community designations were created in the last round were these special features, and they were linked in the memo. And the special features are these basically overlays that represent additional differences between a community. So this is to show that uniqueness of communities better, but they were not included as a variable for community designations, each of them for a variety of reasons. So they did play a role in land use policies later, but again, not specifically included in our spatial analysis. So these layers were station areas on existing and planned transit ways. There are water supply considerations. There's quite a bit of discussion in that area. Job concentrations, where manufacturing and distribution locations were, where educational institutions were located, wastewater service areas as a whole, regionally significant ecological resources, and areas of concentrated poverty and racially concentrated areas of poverty, which we have moved away from, and that data is not represented the same way and has been replaced with the equity consideration data set for a variety of reasons. Next slide, please. So now that you have had a chance to hear about what the current community designations are, what the variables were that went into creating those community designations, and also just generally what were some other considerations in the last round as the special features, we're now trying to explore, are there additional potential variables to consider? Some ideas, as you can see, are on the screen. Should we consider equity? Should we consider natural resources? Maybe future land use, maybe climate adaptation and mitigation, and housing affordability. And these are all suggestions and also very big picture, because something such as equity doesn't by itself represent any certain focus area, but rather a big picture overview that we need to further refine and define what that means for our purposes, right? Next slide, please. So in that sense, now we are asking feedback from you, and we're going to be talking about areas of focus and how they impact communities, as well as the way they manifest in the built environment. So basically, what are the areas of focus to investigate for additional research and data analysis, thinking about the people and community? How is it showing up in your communities? That's as the experts in your local areas. And how do they impact your communities? So for example, if you believe that climate change is an area of, or should be an area of focus, how does it show up in your community? And how does it impact people's lives? Or similarly, equity. Do you see inequities in your communities through disproportionate home ownership, maybe? Or is it a lack of access to transit? Or is it income disparity? How do you see manifestation of different areas of focus or built environment in your community specifically? So with that, I am just opening it up for discussion. I would like to hear from you if you have any thoughts and ideas that you would like to share.
Go ahead, Phil.
Thank you, Chair Wolf. One of the things I was thinking about is I know here in the city of Hugo, we are a very wet area, and putting infrastructure in, especially sewer and water, can be very problematic. As a matter of fact, this last year we had a sewer line that actually dipped. We had to end up going in and raising it and anyways making it work again. But that parts of our area, especially on the east side of Hugo, is very wet, and I'm just wondering, do you take into account the soils as far as the infrastructure that we're putting this infrastructure into? Because some of it, we're not going to be able to maintain it, and expect the growth to develop like it should because of, the geographic area that we live in. Thank you.
Chair, committee members, thank you for this comment. This is actually really helpful. This type of feedback, for example, it can potentially lead to us defining areas that are undevelopable. So in that variable that is what's the developable land, and also later on in helping with the policies that could come into play in certain areas. I do want to mention again that the policies themselves aren't part of this project. However, we still need to analyze and be considerate of their impact. So thank you. This comment is very helpful.
Madam
Phil.
Chair,
May I offer a comment?
I'll do Bill, then John, then Jerry.
Just one comment. When you look out 2040 to 50 on housing, if you look back at this last decade with the housing collapse when everything was affordable, and less than 10 years later, we've had the lowest interest rates for the last 40 years, and which has driven the housing cost up. Currently, I think it's hard to project 20 years from now whether we need more affordable housing or not based on what the interest rates will be and what the Fed policy will be looking that far out. I think it's hard enough for the brightest brains to even look out in the next 4 or 5 years where we're going to be financially.
Thanks. I would agree with that. Things have gotten much more unstable, much more variability, and it's not nearly as predictable as it used to be how things are going to go in the future, which is a big challenge. Did you have anything else, Bill?
I'm just looking for someone that has an answer even in the next 3 years. On interest rates.
John.
Yeah. I have a question, or it's not a question, it's a comment on this potential variable slide. If we are using, I would submit that this is a data-based, the community designation is data-driven, I think, and potential variables should also be data-driven. Some of these are non-measurable and are more opinion statements. So I would prefer that if they're more clearly defined as variables and not subject to opinions or nuance, I guess. One person's definition of something is, if left undefined, is not really, I guess I'll say it this way, these should be clearly defined, these variables, and maybe less subject to interpretation. Otherwise, it's not very good, it's not very useful, in my opinion.
Thank you. I think that's a good point. Any staff response to that?
Madam Chair, committee members, I also want to say thank you. That's a very good point. I have made note of that. At least that is our intention, that it will be data-driven, but informed still by expertise of staff and local officials and planners, so that we can better define our data. Because some of the data points, or even like the variables from the last round, the variable itself was not an existing data point, rather from these conversations and what came out of this is the area that we would like you to focus on is how the variable ended up being created. So, but it's still, the variable is still data driven. However, it is based on feedback and based on informed conversations and discussions. So that is our intention. And Paul had something to add there.
Sorry about that. Couldn't get my unmute off. I just wanted to add to it, hopefully to kind of help you folks think about, what was presented. I think Raya, was presenting this just as thought-provoking, and that, yeah, these aren't necessarily things that we think need to be included, and we're not looking for a general concept, but we're just like, is there something related to these ideas that would from your perspective, be helpful in defining communities? There may not be, but maybe there is something about affordable housing that is useful, but maybe there is not. As you know, we don't know what the future is going to hold, but is that an important variable, or any of these others? So, you know, we're not set in any idea at this point. We're just trying to, you know, throw out thoughts for you to be thinking about. Is there something that would be thought-provoking and helpful?
So Jerry is next up on the list, and then we can come back to Bill again.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Yes, I've been sitting here listening to these staff reports, and I'm having somewhat of a problem kind of comprehending them. I think one factor that you're not talking about, whatever, or addressing is the politics of the politics of the region, the state, whatever. The governor's race is coming up. This is, say, for argument, it changes. So then the politics change, the legislature might change. And so how does this affect the Met Council trying to plan? I mean, your plans today are kind of straightforward. They make sense and whatever, but all of a sudden, boom, politics comes in and kind of flip-flops everything around. How does that, and then in sense, maybe Carver County then would grow faster or whatever, because there may be more money for roads. I mean, in Carver County, you have Highway 7, Highway 5, and Highway 212. Well, 212 is finally getting to be a 4-lane highway after 60 years of planning. Highway 5 is partly built across swamps and everything, so it takes a lot of money to make it 4 lanes, and 7 until you get past Lake Zumbra towards St. Bonnie. There's no way you can make it a 4-lane until then. So I'm just curious, all these plans and your presentations, I don't see that you included politics in your planning, because politics can kind of change overnight. And so I was just curious about that. I'd like to have an answer. Thank you.
Raya, did you want to take a stab at that?
Well, actually, I was gonna ask Angela or Lisa to answer that question.
Angela?
Well, yes, I'm happy to. Thank you, Chair. And I will toss it to Lisa if she wants to add anything on to what I'm about to say. That's exactly why we want this to be data-driven. We understand that things can change. We, as a council, we are always thinking about that, because every 4 years there's another election. What we're doing with the planning process so far is trying to build in resilience, so that it is information coming from local governments, information from the local comprehensive plans, information from stakeholder focus groups and other engagement that is leading and primarily driving the work. Feedback from current council members and others that direct our work. We think with that approach that there will be we still may have to flip on a dime and shift directions, but we have done that before, and we can certainly respond accordingly. But I'll let Lisa speak up if she has anything else she'd like to say as well.
Thank you, Madam Chair, committee members. I appreciate the conversation, and I actually led this project in the last cycle in developing the community designations, and looking back at the 2030 regional development framework, used a lot of the basis from that framework, which was adopted during a different administration, a different political party, and a lot of the core data points that we used around developable land area, where the MUSA was, were similar to what was used to develop the geographic planning areas. That's why we have something like 85% land area. And we didn't just pull it out of thin air. It was used previously in the 2030 Regional Development Framework in a different political administration. So we see with community designations or geographic planning areas or whatever they're called in the 2050 plan, that built environment and how we organize or how we group communities together who are most like one another should be pretty apolitical. Which communities are most like one another? What are the features of the built environment that make that definition? And are we missing, or should we use different factors to define how communities are grouped together, facing similar challenges and thinking about where we would go? We're not yet at policy development, but this is certainly something that is always, of course, on our mind as staff of how do we build ourselves into that direction. But I just wanted to assure folks that yes, we are aware of that, and second, that we are always thinking about those factors that are really specific and using data to help drive our conversation going forward.
Well, and I would add, can I say something first, Jerry?
Yes, go ahead.
I would add that the
I said
system.
no.
I would add that the system statement update thing that we were just talking about before this kind of plays into that. That's why we update our transportation plan every 3 or 4 years, is because funding. You're talking, Jerry, and you're not muted. But the roads and things that are funded can change very, very rapidly. And that's why we have these system updates periodically, because things aren't going to stay the same for 10 years. And they do need to be reflected in city plans. Now you can go ahead, Jerry.
Madam Chair, I was just making a joke. I like to keep conversations light sometimes with the jokes. So I want everybody to know that about me.
Okay.
And as usual, Madam Chair, the Met Council staff is very good at what they do. So I just throw that in.
Thank you. Bill.
Yes. As we look out, and I realize the parks and transportation's being added, but especially when you look at transit, where you're moving to an on-call type service, it's hard to figure out where we're going to be 20 years from now. I'm also wondering how we add in a statement around technology. Just about everything we're putting in today has fiber. So the core work centers will have a significant influence. And then autonomous vehicles, I just think some type of statement should be made as you go into this next round around those elements.
Thank you.
Thank you. Yes, I've made a point of, we're making notes of all of your comments. I do want to reassure you of that, and also say that some of your comments may even have further impact on community designations as staff are later on working on system and policy plans. So thank you for that.
Dan.
Thank you, Chair. I did want to just reflect on, some of the conversation. I think that as we look at, and I understand there were sort of staff conversation starters about other things we might be looking at. It seems the one that stands out to me as something that may make sense to try to quantify in terms of this exercise of the community designations is certainly the future land use. And I would actually say future transportation plans and things like that all should enter into it as well. For instance, obviously there are several arterial bus rapid transit lines planned into the future, and to the extent that communities aren't on those lines, it may affect how we consider their designation. But I would say for sure that issues like equity and climate and sustainability, while they may not inform a community's designation per se, I think that they are still important factors to be taken into account in the appropriate ways throughout the planning process. And so I think the challenge is the $1 million challenge is to figure out what are the ways that those factors need to be taken into account? And I don't know if it's as special feature overlays in this process, or whether it's, once again, as we get into more details about policies and those sorts of things, that we talk about how those factors are affected by the policy proposals.
Thank you. Raya?
Thank you, Madam Chair. I actually wanted to ask a follow-up question, if that's okay.
Of course.
So I heard about like issues of equity, climate, and sustainability. I'm wondering if you're willing to go into a little more detail about that, if you're prepared to explore what that could look like in your mind, what could potentially considering climate in community designation look like, as in how, like, what are the pieces about climate that are impacting communities, so that we're like narrowing down a little bit.
Well, and I can speak from my point of view. I think that was the challenge I was having in looking at those and trying to figure out how they could be factors. And I think that was why I made the comment I made, is that I'm not sure I'm at a place right now where I even understand how those could be considered as factors in community designations. And, but I didn't want that to be sort of a situation where, because maybe we couldn't come up with an answer to that we stopped taking those things into account as part of the overall process. That was my main point of my observation. But yeah, I was having a real challenge. I know that, everything we want to do, we want to be thinking about sustainability. But in terms of how to categorize communities, I don't know that I can quantify what makes a community perhaps more prepared for climate change than another community. I'm not sure that there's a lot of data out there that may help with quantifying that. Likewise with equity, I think there's a lot of conversation would have to happen about, what are the factors that impact how we designate communities, as opposed to factors that may be region-wide that we need to be looking at across all of our policies across the region and things like that. So I don't have a more drilled down answer for you, unfortunately, from my perspective, but that's where I'm coming from.
Thank you. Anybody else? So I've been thinking somewhat about elements of stability. Like we have some communities that the population now is the same population that it's going to have in 10 years, 20 years, 30 years, and not having a whole lot of changes planned for the community. We have some communities that have had radical changes, like the burning down of Lake Street and the loss of all of the workers from downtown, and may or may not be returning to work, and looking at how that impacts a community's development, if that makes sense.
Yes, thank you, Madam Chair. I think that does make sense. And our next task / challenge will become defining how could that translate to something more tangible, right? So, but this is very helpful. Thank you.
Anybody else? Oh, go ahead, Raya.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I just wanted to add, I know we're asking a not very easy question, that it feels a little, it's hard to grasp it at this point, especially me telling you that it's not the policy itself, but rather the basis of policy that we're talking about right now, which makes it a little, even a little harder than to think about it, since we're talking about that far ahead, right? But if it helps you break it down, just think about your communities like right now, even like outside of those topics that you saw on the screen, since, as Paul mentioned, those were just conversation starters. There's nothing is set in stone. Do you see something in your community that you believe is helps make it stand out or make it similar to a different community that you believe is something that should be emphasized? I also do want to mention that part of this project could be that at the very end of it, we come to the point that, you know, the 5 variables that were used in the last round represent everything really well. Let's just stick with it and then, you know, use the special features or something along those lines, like an overlay for policies that come later on. That's also a possibility. So I do want to put that out there. However, we do want to make sure that we are not missing anything that we can include to make the community designations better representative of those similarities and differences, because this is like a grouping exercise, if you will, grouping similarities together. And if nothing comes to mind right now, that's fine as well. If you're thinking about it later on, please do reach out and let us know, as we will continue working on this. Actually, maybe I should just talk on the next slide if that's okay. Great, can we see that slide 15? Next one. Perfect, thank you. Yeah, so as we just talked with you right now, we will continue talking with you. We're talking with our stakeholders, so internal and external, as I mentioned, and also additional committee involvement from other elected officials or appointed officials and or local planners. So we will continue gather feedback similar to the questions that we asked you today, and then we will try to see how we can translate those into potential variables to something that is more tangible, that can be analyzed, and then we will bring those back to you for, hey, what do you think? Does this make sense? Does this represent a focus area that is important for your communities that you're familiar with from a local perspective? And also, what do you think the impact of using such a data point as a variable? How did I start my sentence? What do you think the impact could be? Is this something that we should consider? Is this something that we actually should not consider? So in something such as equity that we mentioned, and I had on screen, for example, a potential variable previously that was housing affordability. In fact, several data points have gone into creating housing affordability, such as home ownership, rental, properties, income, number of households. So all of them together have created that one data point. And so through this exercise, we're trying to identify any areas that maybe it needs additional points to be created, like a variable that we will bring together that would make sense to represent your concerns and areas of focus that you believe we should spend more time on. So we will continue exploring additional variables and gathering feedback. We will start that spatial analysis with different variables. So far, most of the map that you have seen are individual variables, but rather ultimately you will be seeing maps that bring all the variables together and group them together, and that's what you would be making your final decision on. And then we will be exploring the impacts of those variables, and we'll prepare the findings of this analysis for the next meeting of LUAC, which is on May 19th. Is it May 19th? I believe I have the... Yes, May 19th. Just wanted to make sure. So we can go to next slide. Great, thank you. So again, if something comes to your mind that you would like to share, you can reach out to any of us on the project team, myself, Deb, Jake, and Paul that you met today. We are happy to talk about anything with you, or always welcome any feedback that you will have in this process, any concerns that you have that we should be wary of. This conversation would be really helpful in helping us set the direction.
So one of the things that I've been thinking is looking at other things besides just the age of the housing in terms of understanding infrastructure. Like Phil was saying, there are some places where the soils are bad and it makes it really hard to maintain your infrastructure. You know, we have communities that have infiltration and inflow problems and some that don't, depending, you know, if you're crystal and you've got sand and everything kind of the pipes stay nice, or in my neighborhood, the people just to the north of us, the neighborhood is only from the late 80s, early 90s, and they had to dig up all of their water pipes and replace them because the soil was eating the pipes, you know. So looking at other nuances to infrastructure, is the community able to keep up with road reconstruction so that they're always having decent pavement conditions, or is that something that's being deferred and not adequately that they're not adequately able to take care of, kind of thing, if that makes sense?
Yes, certainly. Thank you.
Does anybody else have any thoughts? So is this normally LUAC hasn't been sort of able to watch later, but did we change it now so that people can watch meetings afterwards? Maybe we should send a link out to the people that weren't here today and ask them if they want to chip in with any thoughts. And certainly it's good information to have for future meetings, but you know, reach out to the people who weren't able to be at the meeting and see if they have anything to contribute, I think would be a good idea.
Chair
Kath,
Wolf,
Kath,
I'd
oh,
be
well,
happy to do that.
okay, great. Kathy, did you have something you wanted to say?
I do. Could we see the slide with your contact information again?
You can always pull up the PowerPoint on the agenda too and get it from there.
Okay, I'll do that.
You can reach any of us at any time, and we will be happy to capture any information and feedback that you have.
And if you
Thank
have
you.
more questions that you didn't think to ask yet and need more information, you know, clarifications on something, you can always set up a time to chat with any of our staff for a deeper dive into the information.
Absolutely. Happy to do that anytime. Well, that is all I had for you today.
Thank you.
We
It was
had
a
for you today, I should
very
say.
detailed presentation with a lot of information. Deb, did you have anything that you wanted to say before we adjourn for the day?
Nothing further, Chair Wolf.
Okay, well then, there being no further business to come before the committee, this meeting is adjourned. Thank you very much, everybody, for your thoughtful participation.
Thank you.
Thanks.
See you, everybody.